Good afternoon. Welcome to the Enlace Archive celebration. I'm G. Davis, and I am the university librarian. On behalf of the Department of Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Studies and the University Library, it is my pleasure to commemorate and acknowledge the crucial work of our panelists. Um, Professor Salvador Vidal Ortiz, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology, who joined us via Zoom, our AU alumna, Emma Bush, and Leticia Gomez, author, activist, former president of INLASE, and the donor of the materials you will hear more about in a few moments. And I think our Professor Salvador Vidal Ortiz is not feeling well, but he was just so excited to join us via Zoom. So I really appreciate his presence today. So today we celebrate the Enlace Digital Archive, a milestone collection launched this last fall. Enlace, who is the Spanish word for link, was Washington, D.C.'s first Latina LGBTQ advocacy group. Founded in 1987, just months before that year's March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights, Enlace started largely as a response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic, but it quickly evolved as a way to make the Latino LGBTQ community more visible and to fight discrimination, both within the Latino community and the white LGBTQ community. Leticia Gomez was the first president of Enlace and remains a Latina lesbian activist to this day. Okay. She has preserved the Enlace papers in her home since the group disbanded in mid 1990s. In the 1980s, there were three documented political and socio-cultural organizations in Washington, D.C. that focused on Latino, lesbian, and gay rights. However, there are very few published sources about them. Leticia and Professor Vidal Ortiz worked closely together on their 2015 book entitled Queer Brown Voices, which uses oral history narratives to tell the stories of Latino, Latina, lesbian, gay activists. Enlace featured predominantly in that book. In 2021, Professor Vidal Ortiz brought in Emma Bush, one of his students in the Department of Sociology, to formulate a digitization project that would make the papers more accessible to the public. Emma worked for over a year alongside Letty, Professor Vidal Ortiz, and AU's Archives and Special Collections Unit to create and arrange, describe, digitize these important resources, nearly 500 documents from the NASA. Her project was generously funded by, let's say, the, the Department of Sociology, the AU Honors Program, the Summer Scholars Program, and the University Library. The papers were donated to the Rainbow History Project, and the digital collection is hosted in the University Library's digital repository. So Emma's project is a really perfect example of university libraries' desire to support student scholarship, to work collaboratively with scholars and community partners, and to free information through digitization. Digitizing physical materials is the best way to support important work like Emma's that democratize information, and community knowledge. These types of projects benefit scholars across a variety of disciplines and promote interdisciplinary scholarship. Now, I am pleased to turn today's program over to Professor David Vasquez, Associate Professor in Literature and CRGC, as well as the Program Director of Latinx Studies. He will be moderating the panel with our guests of honor, Salvador, Leticia, and Emma. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope you all enjoyed today's conversation.
Well, welcome everyone, and we're super happy that you're here and that everybody took time out, especially on this really beautiful day, one of the first really beautiful days of spring. So it means a lot that you're all here. So I'm gonna kind of more formally introduce the panel, and then we'll have a conversation for about 20 or 25 minutes, and then we'll have some Q&A, and then we can have some food and socialize with each other and celebrate, because this is a celebration of a really important project and a really important resource for our community. I'm also probably going to channel my Oprah and kind of walk around like a talk show host a little bit. So I'll introduce the panelists in alphabetical order. So Emma Bush graduated from AU in May of 2022 with a degree in sociology and transcultural literature. The Enlace Archival Project was a part of her senior capstone, which encompassed her interest in public histories, counterstory, and queer activism. She currently has a journal article forthcoming, co-authored with Professor Vidal Ortiz, about Enlace and ruptures in the archives. And where is that forthcoming from?
Latino Studies.
Oh,
journal.
Excellent, yeah, Latino Studies, great journal. And in the future, she plans to pursue dramaturgy and performance studies. So welcome, Emma. Leticia Letty Gomez, board member and co-chair of the programming committee of the American LGBTQ+ Museum. She is the co-editor of Queer Brown Voices, Personal Narratives of Latino LGBTQ Activism, and has been a Latina lesbian activist since joining the Gay Chicano Caucus in Houston in 1982. During the 1990s, she was a president of Enlace, a social support organization for lesbian and gay Latinos and Latinas in the DC metro area, and one of the founding chairs of YEGO, the first national Latino LGBTQ organization that was headquartered in Washington, D.C. She served as executive director of YEGO from 1993 to 1995. Letty was among the Latinas organizing for the 1991 National Lesbian Conference, served on D.C. Civilian Complaint Review Board, served on the boards of the D.C. Council on Women and AIDS, the National Lesbian and Gay Health Foundation, AIDS Action, the DC Latino Civil Rights Task Force, and served as a member and secretary of the DC Democratic State Committee. During the 2000s, she served on advisory boards for the Lesbian Services Program of DC's Whitman Walker Clinic, the Rainbow History Project, and the DC Latino-Latina LGBT History Project. She also served on the boards of the Whitman Walker Clinic, Many Voices, La Trenza Leadership, and Congregation Bet Mishpacha. Mishpacha, sorry. She is currently collaborating with Dr. Lourdes Torres on a book documenting the history of YEGO, director, or the editor of Latino Studies. Yeah. So welcome, Letty. Salvador Vidal Ortiz is Associate Professor of Sociology at AU. He facilitated and oversaw the process that led to and the cataloging and digitizing of the Enlace records. He co-authored the book Race and Sexuality, co-edited in English, The Sexuality of Migration, Border Crossings, and Mexican Immigrant Men and Queer Brown Voices, Personal Narratives of Latino LGBT Activism. And in Spanish, Traver el Saber, Transing Knowledge on Education and Trans People in Argentina. He has published over 50 peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and special collection essays, and continues to lead projects for Grupo de Trabajo Feminista y Queer de las Americas, Queer America's Working Group, which seeks to shift power in knowledge production and circulation, and how that impacts work in and from the Americas. In 2019, he was a distinguished scholar in residence at the College of the Holy Cross in the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program. In 2022, he was the inaugural Stephen O. Murray Scholar in Residence at Michigan State University, And in 2024, he will be one of 10 distinguished visiting scholar program fellows at the University of Buffalo. There, he will continue to work on his book on gender, sexuality, and race in Santeria and Afro-Cuban religious cultural practice. Okay, so welcome to our panelists. Yes, lots of applause and celebration. All right, so we're going to kick off with a question for Leti, but hopefully this will be more of a conversation and the other panelists can chime in as well. So can you tell us a little bit about the history of Enlace and your role within it, and how did you come to gather these materials?
Well, I'll start that, is this on? Yeah, I'll start by saying that Enlace was already in formation before I even arrived to Washington, D.C. in 1987. I got here October of 1987, 10 days before the March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights. A friend of mine who had an internship at the Smithsonian said, hey, there's this new group in DC called Enlace. Maybe they can help us organize, because we wanted to have a meeting here in DC of Latino LGBT activists from around the country in Puerto Rico. So he contacted them. They were brand new group, but resourceful. So they found us a room to meet at. They even found us food for our meeting. They started out, it was the brainchild actually of someone that was just forming an HIV/AIDS outreach program called Salud, which was based in Adams Morgan here in DC. And the goal, if you remember, if you know that history, in 1987, we're in the midst of the HIV/AIDS crisis, and access to information for Latinos was little to non-existent, and so Salud was formed to address that. But the majority of people who were becoming infected were gay men, gay Latino men in our community. And so they reached out to some folks that were lesbians and gay men in DC about creating this arm, so to speak, for Salud. But it quickly morphed and evolved into something else that became separate from Salud. During those early years, we always, at events, our events, we would, hand out materials from Salud. A number of our members ended up working for Salud. So that's really how I came to that. And I also want to say that the Latinos who were here, I'm Chicana, I'm from Texas. Judith Arandes, who was actually the first president, Puerto Rican. Jose Gonzalez, who was one of the first members, he was from El Salvador. Dolores Gracia, who's a Spanish woman, she was from Spain. And Margarita Lopez, who was from Colombia. So it was, DC already was this international community of Latinos. And so for me, it was also eye-opening because, I come from a place where I'm the majority of Latinos in Texas, but here it's everyone has come together here. As far as the question of how did I come to these materials, I'm a saver. If you ever come to my house, Emma knows. When she came to the house, I had boxes of stuff. David, I just felt like it was really important for me personally to save this material, and I just, I saved a lot of other stuff that I've been involved in. But when I was working on Queer Brown Voices with Salvador and Uriel, it occurred to me that we were documenting these histories, but there are all these other stories, right? And in DC, I had also had the unfortunate experience of being interviewed for a book about Queer DC, and then having the author tell me that he didn't find enough room to include our stories in that book. So I thought, okay, that, we cannot rely on other people to write our history. We have to write our own history. So through that Queer Brown Voices experience, and then also just remembering other activists that I've known, there was a woman here who had documented hundreds of hours of video of various LGBT events, not just all events. Her apartment caught on fire, and most of her videos were destroyed. Other people who have died, activists who died, their families come into their homes, see stuff, throw it away. So I just felt like at some point I needed to preserve this by giving it to some place that would honor it and preserve it. So it was just fortunate for me that Salvador, introduced me to Emma, and Emma had this idea, that she wanted to spend time on this. So it was really a wonderful solution to this one issue of my enlace materials that I had the good fortune of working with them.
Wonderful, thank you for that. So let me pass it off to Salvador. And can you give us a little bit of an overview of the archives and the kinds of materials people might expect to find in them? And I have a second question, which is, what kind of special or unique things did you find that you found really surprising or enlightening or important in some way?
Thank you for that question, David. And welcome to everyone. I can only see David, Letty, and Emma. So I'm hoping that you get the food and you get the drinks and you get to enjoy it. I wanted to say that for those of you who might have come in after the initial introduction, AU hosts the digital archives, which are structured in a different way. The boxes as donated to the Rainbow History Project, which is the physical copy of the archives, were structured into 3 main boxes, and a lot of the material as it was donated was alphabetical. So we have HIV/AIDS, we have collaborations, we have Enlace as a local organization working with Llegó. Enlace had a lot of newspaper coverage in the late 80s and early 90s, both in straight Latino newspapers and in gay white newspapers. So you'll see some of that there. A lot of internal documents about the organization and how activists wanted to develop the strategic planning or 5-year plans so that they could actually fundraise and extend the life of the organization. So, and there was also, I don't want to forget this, a hotline, Hola Gay, which is a hotline that served for about 3 or 4 hours a week. Gay, lesbian, Latinos, and Latinas who wanted to call, who maybe were monolingual Spanish speakers and had questions about like which bars to go to, whether there were support groups, how to handle coming out issues, maybe questions of immigration. So the organization's archives have a lot of very personable, like very individual data. They have letters from people from California all the way to Chile, and they enact the sort of hunger that there was in the 80s and early 90s for people to want to find community, to have a sense of belonging, right? I think beyond sort of the categories in which the archive is organized, for me, one of the most important things is not to sort of stretch the idea of the stereotype, but I think folks in Enlace knew how to have fun. And there's a lot of elements about cultural events, about bailes and dances, right, about parties, that give you a sense of the spatial geopolitics in DC where Latinos were able to be. And so you get a lot of a sense of enjoyment and enjoy in a way in which it wasn't cliche, right? Like people were trying to find a space to exist and to thrive before we made those words very popular. So all of that is really evident in the archives. And I think what is most surprising to me about the archives is that balance between the organizational documentation to understand the life of an organization as a 501c3 group, as a CBO, community-based organization, but also all of the narratives of the people that were involved, right? They're sort of braided together in these archives. And I think that's what's powerful. I got to show Emma what a fax looked like at some point with the yellow borders, right? Like there's also something really beautiful about the historical component of these archives, and to be able to just jokingly pass on that knowledge to students and colleagues and to say, this is how people networked before social media, right? And how they got together. So I think that was particularly unique and for me to share with others from the archives.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for that. So I want to ask a question of both Emma and Salvador. What really inspired you to do this work, and what drew you to this archive in particular? And can you tell us a little bit more about some of the things, maybe Emma, that you discovered in the archive that you found really interesting or surprising?
Yeah, of course. So I came to this project in the spring semester of my junior year, and that spring I was taking 2 classes that sort of worked in tandem to draw my interest towards this project. One of them was a class on pre-Stonewall queer history, and in the course of that class, I found that a lot of the content that was coming up was about a lot of white gay men who had attended either Ivy League schools or who came from families of a lot of generational wealth. And a lot of the stories and documents that we were reading were all focused on white lesbians or gay men. And if there was a few other stories, it was all very tokenized and it didn't feel like a full fleshed out story of what queer life really was pre-Stonewall. And then at the same time, I was in Professor Vidal-Ortiz's class, Approaches to Queer Studies, which was very actively working to look at and call out the whitewashing of queer history. And so for that class, our final project was to choose an archive, any archive of our choice, and write a research paper on something within its content that we found interesting. And so I chose to look at the Bay Area Reporter, which was the queer newspaper of San Francisco in the 80s, and I wanted to look at the Third World Gay Caucus, which was an organization there of queer people of color, and I wanted to look at how they were organized and what types of work they were doing. This was again around the time of the March on Washington and in the period of the 80s and 90s. But within the Bay Area Reporter, it was just small news clippings. I was word searching as much as I could on this online database. So I was using a digital archive, being here in DC and looking at the West Coast. And I was seeing firsthand how hard it was to find in-depth information. It would be here's an advertisement for an open mic that's going to be hosted. And then I would see some names of people who would be presenting. So then I would search for those people's names to see if they were involved in anything else. But even if I heard that an event was happening, there wasn't much information on the content of the event, how it happened, what it was like, how it turned out. And so I would have conversations with Professor Vidal-Ortiz in office hours, just kind of about my questions about what else could have been happening. And that's when he started to tell me that Leti had this collection from a DC organization of this kind. And I think it was really beautiful then that through the process, it became important to be able to preserve Enlace's documents beyond the Washington Blade articles and the Washington City paper. But instead, we see those same articles and the flyers that were about them, the newsletters that explained how they went, all of the internal communications. And so now it felt important to, as a student in Washington, D.C., be able to not only learn about the city in my classes, but then preserve something so that now that content can be useful for anyone else who has a similar interest in the future.
Do any of the other panels have anything they want to add?
I would just say that a lot of this was a product of serendipity, and that had I not been in conversation with Leti about the archives and then with Emma and about her interest, it would have not happened. So I think in many ways, Emma was a very crucial inspiration in making this happen, because she's the one that put her body on the line, literally, to actually look at the material, catalog it, engage with it, ask questions, sort of wonder, is there gossip here? But also sort of notice the sort of magic aspects of getting a letter from Chile in this organization that's in Washington, D.C. That's not a national organization that has this flashy title, but a small local organization, right? The venture of having Emma always re-energized by the archives was in a way a lot of what kept me, I don't want to speak for Letty, but kept me engaged in the project. I would also say, and I'll be brief, that for me, and maybe to a certain extent for Letty, on the one hand, we were exposed to sort of control by Latino queer organizations about how history was being shown to others, right? So Latino gay and lesbian organizations were not really doing a lot of the labor of sharing the work, the archives, doing oral histories. So again, speaking for myself, we both became very frustrated, but I'm going to own it. And then with Emma, then the experience of sort of finding this whitewash where all of the history that's gay lesbian history is white, right? Like, so between the sort of control of archives on the one hand, perhaps for personal purposes, who knows? And then on the other, like the engagement with a queer history that was inherently white, right? Like there were these voids that we saw as opportunities to be able to just document it, to be able to pass it on.
Can I ask a follow-up that is a little bit impromptu, but that I hope will evoke some aspects of the archive for you? Could you each tell a little bit of one of the stories that maybe stood out for you that you discovered? Letty talked earlier about, you know, the sort of histories and stories that haven't made it into the archives. And I'm curious if there's a particular thing that you discovered, or maybe Letty that you sort of rediscovered as you were going through the materials that really stands out for you as the kind of story that you really want people to know about.
Well, I think there's so much there. You know, I actually I had forgotten about Hola Gay. And Hola Gay, that hotline was, as Salvador described earlier, you know, it was very actively used, and we had a number of very dedicated volunteers who volunteered their time to, you know, staff this phone line that people could call. I think the other thing too, though, is the just remembering through just looking at some of the newsletters. How diverse even our own community was. So like, you know, I come here from Texas, you know, I have a master's degree. We had people in the organization that held 2 or 3 jobs because, you know, they were, you know, immigrants, but, you know, it was important for them to be part of our organization, and to be in community really is probably more of it than not. And just to be reminded of that, I think, to me was, it was just, you know, it brought good memories, and, you know, and I still have friendships from friends that I made through Enlace from, you know, 30 years ago. So it, you know, it does hold a special place in my heart with those memories, yeah.
Like Professor Vidal-Ortiz was mentioning a moment ago, I think one thing that stood out to me, in addition to all of the local DC activities and community building and like political activism, was like this collection of letters that Enlace received. There's a letter from Uruguay, and there was a community of gay and lesbian folks who had heard about Enlace and were basically writing, talking about the discrimination that they were facing from their community and their governments, and basically expressing solidarity for Enlace and the work that Enlace was doing in the US. There's a letter from someone in Spain. There's a letter from a gentleman in New Mexico that was basically like a personal advertisement, like, I'm looking for a partner. Like, here's my description, here are my hobbies and my interests, please publish this wherever you can. There's a letter from a student who was attending Smith College that she had heard about Enlace, and she was a young Latina lesbian, and she wanted to write about Enlace for a school project, and she had written a letter saying, is there any way that we could be in communication so that I can include this in a school project? So it was really seeing like this network and the impact that Enlace had, even beyond the city and the community and the important work here, but that word of it was spreading. And there is like just these networks across the globe and across the country that were really impacted by it.
Story you'd like to add, Salvador?
No, thank you.
All right. Let's see. I think I want to move to our last proposed question, and then we can open it up for questions and comments from the audience. So the question I want to ask is, the materials that you donated, Leti, reflect queer Latino life in DC during the late 80s and 90s. And why did you think this material was particularly important to preserve? And I'd like to also ask, upon reflection, how Emma and Salvador are thinking about these questions.
Sure. Well, you know, if we're talking about DC history, you know, DC history, for the most part, has been a black and a white history. And I want to make a pitch here for the DC History Center. But it's been a black and white history, but, you know, beginning in, you know, mid-20th century, other people started moving to DC. And certainly in the case of Latinos, you know, because of conflicts in other parts of, you know, especially Central and South America, there was migration to the U.S. And in particular in D.C., you know, we have a large Salvadoran community. We have people here from all over Central America, South America, the Caribbean, and so to me, you know, that confluence of people, the fact that, you know, we were organizing and trying to build community here, and starting in the mid to late 80s, and that it still exists today. You know, I think to me that it was important to preserve the materials for, you know, researchers and historians, but also so that this part of the history doesn't become invisible and forgotten. I think that was the most important thing, and so donating it to Rainbow History and working with, you know, Leslie and the folks at in the program here just made that possible, and so that was important. And DC History Center has just formed a Latino advisory group to focus on, you know, documenting the history of Latinos in DC. Of course, you know, including LGBT people, but really the breadth of Latinos in DC. So I think that's an important step that the DC History Center has taken. The other thing is, and I recently saw the play on High Ground at the Arena Stage, and that really, it's in part based on the Greenwood Massacre in Tulsa that I think many of you may have heard about. That, you know, that history was unknown to many people. And it was really because of this one woman, a black woman who lived in Greenwood at the time, that after the massacre started documenting oral histories. It was her personal effort to document this that makes this history now available to us. And so to me, you know, preserving any history is really important, because years from now, you know, someone could ask, well, you know, was there anyone organizing LGBT Latinos in DC? Well, yes. And after Enlace, there was Helam, there was another group called Acuarela, there was Grupo Platiquemos, the DC Latino LGBT History Project, now DC Latinx Pride. So, and I'm hoping that there are people in those organizations that are also saving materials, because that is other material that, you know, documents those histories. So I'll stop with that, but I just think it's just really important for any community, any peoples to document their history and preserve those voices.
Emma?
Yeah, similarly to what Letty was just saying, I think, like, speaking from a younger generation of people, like activists across a broad swath of like issues, I think for me, reading the internal letters of Enlace, seeing how they presented events or the things they took into consideration for different panels and things, I saw a lot reflected in conversations that I've been having with people in my own community, and the words and phrases that they used really spoke to me, and there's a lot of power in the way that words can be used. And so I think it's important that as we continue in our own endeavors for whatever things that we care about and issues that are important or close to our own hearts, that we see that a lot of work for queer activism has been done before, and there's words and ideas and processes that we can continue to use and build upon, and that even if we're joining it at whatever point that we are, it's not starting with us, and it's not going to end with us either. And so a big part of this project that's been important to me is thinking about the temporality and the integration of like history, the present, and what's going to be found in the future. And so just because we might, Enlace hadn't been documented like institutionally up until this year, it doesn't mean that it wasn't there. And now that it is more formally preserved, what can that mean for the future? How does that change the conversations that people had been having, and what will they now be? And I think that goes across a broad swath.
Thank you, David. We've learned that just because something happened doesn't mean that it became history unless we get involved and make it part of history, particularly for communities that are multiply minoritized. So I think for me, that era of the 80s to 90s is particularly important to document and share with others. It happened, like the marches, the vigils, the attacks on gay and lesbian people, the drag queen shows, the carnivals, all of that happened. And we need to make sure that other generations know that it happened, that we organized in different ways, that we used different language, that social media wasn't even imaginable at that point. That's also connected to how I think Enlace did a lot of the groundwork to set up a local organization that connected to national groups, but also did their own sociopolitical agenda. And I also think this is important because Enlace in particular did a lot of intersectional work. So it wasn't about gay and lesbian Latinos doing work for gay and lesbian Latinos. They were doing that, but there were marches on Take Back the Night. There were engagements in Congress on domestic violence. There were so many Black-brown dynamics that are embroiled in the history of groups like Enlace. And in a moment in 2023 where, to cite Rod Ferguson writing One Dimensional Queer, we think of a gay and lesbian agenda as being only about sexuality, looking back at these kind of projects and the work that they did to make themselves think of a group larger than themselves, while they also nurtured their community, I think it's vital. Otherwise, how do we survive this moment if we're not engaged with what we can learn from the past?
I think that's a really wonderful place to end this portion, but there's one important piece that we forgot to talk about. So where can people find the archives? So, Leslie, do you want to?
Well, we have a bit.ly for it. It's bit.ly/AU_Enlace. We will post on social media the link again, and it is out there. It's Google searchable. If you just search Enlace Archive, you'll find the link to it. You can find it in a number of places. For AU students, it's on the A to Z list. It's in subject guides. It's there. You'll find it.
Awesome. So we have about 10 or 15 minutes or so for questions. So I'll ask that you raise your hand so that I can bring you the microphones. Oh, okay. Leslie will bring you the microphones. So, so who has questions?
Thank you. Hi, Emma. Hi, Letty. Hi, Professor Vidal-Ortiz. I was wondering, Professor Vidal-Ortiz had mentioned, something just recently about, drag queens and marches. I was wondering, specifically for Letty and Professor Vidal-Ortiz, but Emma, you're more than welcome to answer as well. There's this kind of concerted effort now against drag queens, queer culture, and stuff like that, specifically in K through 12 education. Could you talk about what parallels you see from your time and your advocacy back in the 80s and 90s, and and this current movement that's happening, as well as what can younger activists learn from you all, and what strategies can they use right now to combat that? Thank you.
Well, Salvador, maybe you had a different experience. I don't recall ever having, someone object to a drag show, actually, there is a performer at Perry's, which does the drag brunch every Sunday, Sofia Carrero. Sofia was doing drag back in the 90s, and she still does drag. This is part of how she makes a living. I don't understand it, and like in so many states right now, there's, I think Arkansas is banning drag shows. I honestly don't understand it, because we really didn't have to deal with that back then. It was, it was performance. It was in our bars. I think the what's different today, though, is the fact that there is an increasing number of people who are becoming transgender, who are transitioning, and so that is different. And I think when we started out, you hear a lot about, we refer to lesbian and gay rights, because that's what we were focused on. And but we evolved as well. Then we were talking about bi rights, transgender rights. So our movement has evolved as well in terms of, how do we stand up for each other? And there have been a number of legislative fights, I remember in years past, where some member of our community said, oh, transgender person, we'll get to you later. Or lesbian, we'll get to you later. No, I mean, this is something that we have to fight even within our own community, that we have to stand up for each other. So with what's going on right now, I think what I've seen is like the equality packs around the country, they're stepping up, but they cannot do it by themselves. Those of us that are that this is important to, and our allies, we have to participate with them. We have to go to those rallies. We have to go to those marches. We have to give money to support these efforts, because that part of that group of people in the United States that doesn't want to see us it's a little scary, quite frankly. So we have to continue to fight that movement. Just like, we've gotten these rights that we have today through struggle, through concerted community efforts, and so this is just one more that another series of challenges that we have to face as a community with our allies.
Other panelists? More questions?
Hi, I'm actually a current student fellow with the Archives. I'm also a public history master's student, so I kind of have like an archival question. Something we think about a lot, like doing archives work, is like permissions and consent. Did you come across any issues where, like, for example, like someone maybe who was photographed, they didn't want their image and likeness to be put into the archives, or any sort of issue like that? And how did you navigate those issues?
Yeah, so most of the documents we dealt mostly with documents up until the very end, when I think we had maybe 6 photographs, but otherwise it's all completely, text documents. We did include everything except for personal information. If there's anything like an address, a phone number, any like identifying information, bank statements, either there were documents that we took out completely because we figured that like the information on them was mostly just like a check to the bank that was less contently important, or if the content was important, Leslie helped us go through and redact everything so that no personal information would be shared. For other questions, I think I mostly deferred to Letty and her consent on whether things should be included or shouldn't be included, or how to like respect the stories of Enlace. Yeah,
we did. I remember we did have a little bit of a back and forth about. We had, like, for our meetings and some events, we'd have sign-in sheets, yes. And And to me, it was important to show the number of people that signed in to come in to whatever it was. But we decided in the end that to leave those out because of all the personal information. As far as the photos that you'll see on the AU site, I did go back and ask the folks in the photos if they minded us putting that up. And there's going to be a phase 2 because I have a lot more photos that Leslie and I are going to be working on digitizing to add to the collection. But so there'll be more of that, I think. Trying to reach out to people who hopefully I can still reach.
Yeah, I think we did decide like on names if they had been like an officer or in a leadership position within LASE, because then they were already communicating publicly, that we would include those. But yeah, if it was someone who was just a member and never like signed any letters or did anything like that, we respected privacy on that.
Hey, I'll stand up. I'm Molly. I also work in the archives, and I was lucky enough to work alongside Emma while she was here, and her like attention to detail and like meticulous metadata collecting was very inspiring to me because I'm not as good at that as she is. But I have a question for Letty. As at the same time that you were processing this collection, I was processing a collection about lesbian activism through OUT, ACT UP, and the Safer Sex Sirens. And I was wondering how your activism within LASE kind of worked with the other queer liberation groups in DC at the time, if there was a lot of like if you guys like hung out together or like partied together or maybe not.
We did actually, so Enlace was part of the GLOVE, which was Gay and Lesbians Opposing Violence. And this was a group that was formed, because the other thing that was going on, the police were, beating up people back then, and so, or arresting, gays and lesbians. So this group was formed, and it was a coalition of various LGBT groups in DC. It was Enlace, I forget the name of the black gay group that was here at the time, and GLAA and some of the other groups that I think are still around. As far as partying, yes, we actually Enlace hosted a couple of parties at the Washington, what's the name of it? Washington Plaza Hotel. And we had, there was a gay Palestinian group here at the time. So it was Enlace, the gay Palestinian group, the black gay and lesbian group. There was an Asian group. And so we had this party, actually we had two. We had this one big party where we had like representative dances from our cultures there. So it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun, yeah.
I want to add, there was this one really cool document, and it was, I think, a picnic hosted by the Asian gay and lesbian group at the time, and it was like basically an invitation to Enlace to all come play volleyball and like have an opposing volleyball game. But that's one of my favorite documents.
I don't remember. I don't think I played volleyball then.
Other questions?
I have to say something about metadata though. She's like the queen of metadata. When she had to explain to me what it was, first of all, but when I went over to the what do you call your office?
Archives and Special Collections.
Archives and Special Collections, and she to kind of finalize the metadata, and the amount of work, Molly, I know what you're up against because I saw what Emma had to do. The amount of information and the attention to detail is just amazing and astounding, and you're really awesome in that regard. So.
Emma, can you just explain what metadata is for those people who are maybe newer students?
So the first part of like the digitization process was just scanning all of the documents and keeping them just like individual images, and then the next part of the process is going through and separating like multi-page documents all together. So if something was double-sided, that's one document and one item. But then the metadata is then the date that goes with each document, who created it. Was it by an individual person or was it an organization? What is the title of the document? And what is a short description of it, so that you want to make sure that you include keywords about the document so that someone can search it and it will pop up to like anything that is even closely relevant. And so it's just a giant spreadsheet with page numbers, dates, names, but it's just you want to make sure everything's correct so that you're not accidentally copying and pasting something that's like a completely different date and time from something above, that no names are misspelled, and that you're fact-checking any descriptions that you're writing. I think for me personally, the descriptions were the most subjective part of this process, and that a lot of people might think that archival work is very objective. It's just like you're taking the document, you're copying the information, and then you're putting it out. But in fact, every step of the process from your own position and your own positionality and social location as an archivist is important to consider throughout the whole process. And I found that most coming to the front with the organization of the metadata. And when there were choices of even as small as like, how many copies of this document do we want to include? Do we include like 5 copies because every single one has a different handwritten note on it? Do we include how many drafts of something, even if they're all the same, but they each have a different font? Because there's some things that's like, there's Arial, there's Times New Roman, there's Times New Roman italicized, and one's in a bigger font. And so that's when it comes in, it's like, I don't know. I think it's important, so I think it's interesting talking to Leslie and Letty, like, Letty, do you think this is relevant? Or is it just busy? But yeah.
So maybe one more question and then we'll eat.
I just wondered, Letty, if you're still collecting anything since you said you were a collector.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I am. Well, I'm not so much collecting. I still have many more boxes. So you heard the number of organizations that I've been involved with. So I have some of those materials that I want to donate somewhere. The biggest one, though, is YEGO, the National Latino Lesbian and Gay Organization. And when that organization closed in 2004, I think I was telling G, the librarian, that we boxed all that up and we sent it down to University of Texas at Austin to the Benson Collection. But I still, as Dr. Torres and I are working on the book, we're collecting more from people that we're interviewing. So eventually, when we're done with the book, we're going to send that stuff down to University of Texas. And they also are working on not our digital collection, but they're all, I mean, I think all universities, from my understanding, is they're working towards really creating this digitization of materials. And so I think that, and making them accessible, I think that's really important to, not just historians and researchers, but to anyone that's just curious. The lesbian or gay Latino that's sitting out in Nebraska and just, they'll find something. So I think it's important in that respect. Thanks for asking.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists for their time and generosity today, but more so for creating this incredible resource and making it available not just to our community here at AU, but to the public at large. So thank you so much.
And David, I just want to thank the university, American University. Leslie, you and your staff, really, thank you so much for everything.
We couldn't have done it without her.
And I just really greatly appreciate the work that all of you are doing to preserve this history and other histories, because it is just so important for future generations. Thank you.
All right, well, let's give our panelists another round. And I invite everyone but Salvador to enjoy our food.
Bye, Salvador.
Ciao.